Book 87 of 2019 was Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis. When I got this book from the library, I didn't realise that the book was about what it was about. I thought it was going to be about women, about race and about class, but actually it's about the intersectionality of those three things, which I guess is kind of interesting. Similarly, I didn't know who Angela Davis was. I do know who she is now, and it was quite nice to read actually, because I'd read Reni Eddo-Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, and absolutely, thought that it was subjective conjecture, and was actually quite discriminatory against white people. And I wondered whether that was because I was white and that was my race and my perception of it. And I thought, because I'd actually been accused of that by someone who was black, and I was like, actually, no, that isn't true. And this book made me realise that even more, because whilst that one's very journalistic and very kind of like, it's not backed up with any evidence at all, whereas Angela Davis is very clear with, the way that she writes is more academic. She's got evidence there. She goes through what's actually happened in history and how that kind of demonstrates racism of the time. So she goes through kind of like the historical events, and she talks as well about like a point that isn't addressed by people who talk about white privilege and whatever, is that without white abolitionists there wouldn't have been political reform, there wouldn't have been the Slave Trade Act of 1807. It just wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't have been able to have freedom and emancipation. Is that the right word, emancipation? What does that mean? You wouldn't have had freedom anywhere from slavery if white abolitionists hadn't have been there suggesting that it should be abolished, because black people weren't respected, so they wouldn't have been respected in the political arena. So that needed to have kind of happened. It kind of shows as well that not all white people were slave owners and were racist. Obviously there was a lot of them that were, not denying that, but there were a lot of them that weren't as well. So I think that's kind of like ignored a lot when, particularly by people like Reni Eddo-Lodge. Davis kind of discusses as well how this kind of fight for the freedom from slavery and against the kind of human rights, what's the word? Human rights atrocities, against human rights, that it kind of prompted the first wave of feminism, because white middle class women were starting to analyse their own oppression and their own lack of human rights in relation to a man. And at this point, Davis mocks white middle class women because, they are comparing their plight to black slaves, which there is no comparison there at all. Like, the oppression of women is no comparison at all to the oppression of black people in terms of slavery. Like, there's just no comparison there. Being a black slave is considerably worse than being a white female, even in those oppressive times. So she's right to mock them. And what she suggests as well is that those white middle class females that were protesting for the abolishment of slavery were projecting their own views of emancipation. So they were doing it because they wanted their own freedom and not because they actually wanted the freedom of the black slaves, because at times they were still particularly racist. In a lot of their speeches they were racist, so Davis quotes them. And also they wouldn't let black women joined their feminist groups. So they weren't really trying to abolish slavery, they were trying to abolish their own oppression by focusing on slavery, because it did show a lack of human rights, which is quite interesting, her portrayal of that. I'm sure that there were still people who didn't do it just for their own perspective and didn't do it just because they wanted to be emancipated. I think that there was something, she does actually give other examples as well. She's very kind of, she's not biased in the way that she's presented it. She is slightly on the side of mocking white middle class people, but she does kind of, you know, demonstrate that there's another side. So for example, there was a woman who wanted to teach a black girl in her school, and the school got burnt to the ground because the other white people didn't agree with it, but she, you know, still wanted to kind of do that. So it kind of shows that there were people that were fighting. I think what you've got to understand is it's all kind of very easy nowadays to say that, you know, everyone in the past was racist, but there's a lot of kind of, if you didn't kind of conform with that status quo, you would also be in danger, you would also be killed and whatever else. So you have to consider what it was like for those people. It's like, you know, if you think about Nazi Germany, there's lots of people that weren't Nazis but went along with it for their own safety, and that's kind of a similar thing. You know, it's not right what happened, but I can understand and empathise with people that didn't stand up for it, because they would have severe negative consequences if they did challenge that status quo. What Davis also mentions is that the abolishment of slavery, whilst it was, you know, done and it was a good thing, it actually ended up creating harsher living conditions for black people, because not only, you know, like they had the same work to do as what they had to do before, they still got beaten by the people that they were working for, who used to be their slave owners and had more, you know, kind of animosity towards them because they'd been liberated, and yet now they didn't, you know, like if you were a slave owner, you wouldn't want to maim or kill your property, so you would, you know, not beat them as much. But now there was no kind of, that protection wasn't there for black people. They were, you know, potentially could be killed if they did something wrong, deemed to be wrong by the people that they were working for. And similarly, those employers could manipulate a capitalist system and make them work for longer to be able to simply survive and feed themselves and shelter themselves, which they now have to think about, because they didn't have to think about that before, as they were fed and they were homed, not in particularly nice, you know, dwellings and things like that, but they probably wouldn't be able to afford anything nicer anyway. So they were kind of almost like, yeah, you've got your freedom, but you know you live even worse than what you did before. So it was kind of like a, you know, it wasn't necessarily a good thing for it to happen at that point. Obviously, it is good overall. This is another thing that Davis mentions, that is that, sorry, I read it on there and then I was like, this is another, but I need to tell you what I'm actually going to talk about. White middle class females were talking about how housework was oppressive, and so there's a whole kind of discussion of, a lot of the time when people are viewing white people, they're kind of viewing middle class white people. So it's not even the fact that they're white, it's the fact that they're middle class. Like how middle class behave is different to how working class behave. And working class people were not slave owners. Working class people could not afford to have a slave. So working class people were very unlikely to be racist, because they would be working in a similar way to what black people were working. And so you can't really just say, oh, all white people, because class is there, class is an issue. Class is, you know, a white working class person is different to a white middle class person. You know, I don't think the whiteness is the thing that's causing them to be different. I think it's more the class, and the class that you're at. Obviously, in those days, being black meant that you were of a lower class, so there is the intersectionality of that there, and obviously that's not right. So that's also discussed in the book, so that was quite interesting. And then Davis also talks about the myth of the black rapist. It was kind of like manipulated so that they had an excuse for lynching black people. You know, they'd been freed as slaves. Now they had to have something else to kind of control them by and exert power over them by. So they would, you know, suggest that the reason they were lynching black men was because they were rapists, when actual fact this was just kind of made up. And actually, white men used rape as a form of terror towards women, particularly black women, for years and years and years, and no white man was being lynched. So it's absolutely disgusting that that even happened. The scenes that she describes were really horrific. Like, I can't imagine how awful it must have been to be stolen from your house and like dragged from your house, like along the floor. Like, I think I think I'm remembering somewhere that like a horse like drags you out by you like your feet on a rope, and then you're just strung up on a tree or whatever to die, like it's and die by hanging as well. It's just awful. It's awful. I can't imagine how anybody could have thought that that was right, that that was okay to do to another person. Like it's disgusting, no matter what race you are, what background you are, what class you are. It shouldn't matter. You're a human being, and you should not have that happen to you. So it is absolutely disgusting. Davis also talks about reproductive rights for women, and how she mentioned something about how a lot of black women were sterilised because they were deemed to be, not as superior to white genes, I guess you could say. If you think of like colonialism and stuff, it was kind of viewed that black people were savages and therefore didn't have any intellect, which again is absolutely disgusting. Very ethnocentric in the viewpoint. Davis mentioned something like that America in the 30s, I guess she was mentioning. Was she mentioning 30s? I don't know, I think I just made that up. America sterilised more women than Hitler ever sterilised. And at first I thought, wow, that's a lot. And then I thought to myself, well, Hitler's Nazi regime, concentration camp, experimentation and things like that, and sterilisation and things, he probably didn't sterilise as many because he killed them all. So it's slightly different. I don't think you can really use that as a support for your point, because Hitler just killed them rather than sterilising them. But either way, it prevented, from people being, I guess when you think, you always think like white people are more dominant in a country, but it's probably because of things like, in fact, no, I'm not going to actually talk about that because I don't really know what I'm saying, because it would depend on country of origin and things. But anyway, this book was really, really interesting. It was very well written, very academically kind of presented, evidence-based. There is obviously opinion from the author because she's a black woman. So there is kind of like, she has an opinion about these things. She does mock certain groups, which might not happen if she wasn't a black woman, but I think she does try to stay as neutral as possible. So yeah, I found it interesting. I would recommend reading it, whatever race or gender you are, because I think it provides some insightful discussion of history. But what I always kind of say is you can't judge today by the past. The people that were in the past, it's very, very different. There's different views about things in today's society, and I think anybody in today's society, regardless of your race or your gender or whatever intersectionality things that you're made up of, finds it absolutely disgusting that people were slaves and that people were treated like that. And I think if you don't think like that, then it's very odd that you don't think that that's atrocious, because if it was happening to you, I'm sure you would think very differently about it. So yeah, I would recommend reading this book.